Hi everyone. So I am gonna discuss the readings, the chapters, the articles that we had this week. So I guess I'm gonna start right away by just talking about chapter 4, which talked a lot about censorship and intellectual freedom, which really kind of go hand in hand. Um, so I really liked the discussion of censorship because I am very passionate about the concept of banned books. This has always been something that I was very uncomfortable with because I really do not think that we should be censoring what students are reading, and this does tie into intellectual freedom, which the book mentions is someone's right to seek and obtain whatever knowledge that they choose to obtain. Um, so, going into this discussion of censorship, on page 90, the book gives this big long list of a bunch of topics that are normally censored in literature when people are choosing which books to publish, what books to put in their library. There's a big long list of them. It talks about, you know, sexual content, profanity, a lot of mental health issues, racism, sexism, a bunch of different things that really result in a bunch of really great literature being banned from our schools and from our libraries. And this, I think, comes from a lot of different places. The book mentions that sometimes this comes from people ban books or censor books or material because it wasn't what they were reading when they were growing up. And I think we have to broaden the intellectual freedom that we allow our students, because if we have all of these censorship laws, it really closes the students' minds to a lot of subjects and content. And I think it's really important that we try to facilitate students being more open-minded as opposed to more closed-minded. So I think, on the note of intellectual freedom, I think we as educators and future educators should always advocate for the intellectual freedom of our students, but it also is talked about that we should take into account what the parent wants for their student. Obviously, we have to take into account that the parent in their mind is doing what is best for their child. So, in one of our other classes with Rachel, we recently wrote book rationales. So we took a piece of literature and we considered all of the reasons why it might be controversial in a classroom, and we had to write a rationale. So I think if you're going to choose literature for your classroom that maybe some would consider controversial or consider that it maybe would need to be censored, I think you should advocate for intellectual freedom of your students. You just have to be able to then back it up with reasons why you are teaching it and a rationale of why it's in your classroom. So next I'm just going to go into chapter 5 a little bit, which talks about more in depth about realistic fiction. And I like how they started the chapter off right off the bat on page 126. It stated that the term is kind of an oxymoron because it's talking about events that happened in real life, but there's also a fiction element of it. And also on page 126, it talks about how realistic fiction really is making meaning out of a series of events or out of one event and portraying them with new ideas or from new viewpoints that maybe the reader would find more relatable. One of the things I really liked that chapter 5 talked about was the different types of books that can fall under the realistic fiction genre. It talks about books that have alternating viewpoints. It talks about multi-genre pieces. And I think this is really important to bring up because I feel like it really expands the idea of what people think a realistic fiction book can be. So something that goes along with all of those different kinds of books that are offered in the realistic fiction genre, the multi-genre and the alternating viewpoints, it provides a bunch of different perspectives that the students might have not had before. So that first article that we were linked to, it states that young adult readers really, really love and latch on to pieces where the characters are captivating and relatable. And chapter 5 states that all of these different perspectives can provide students with all of this diversity. And we've talked a lot about offering diversity to our students, and that's another reason why I feel so passionately about censorship and banned books. It's because if we don't expose these students to these viewpoints, it could close off a whole area that they might never be exposed to. And I think the more viewpoints we offer them, especially in books where students are being exposed to 2 or 3 different perspectives about the same story, they might relate. There's a higher chance that they're going to relate to something that they're reading. And I think that's really important for also diversifying the reading material in your classroom and offering students a lot of different perspectives that they may have not had the opportunity to read. And just to tie in that last article that we talked about, there's a quote in that article that says, "As the child has changed, so is literature," and vice versa. And I think that's a really important point because, like the first article says, when we're talking about these real young adult readers, these real students that we're going to have in our classroom, they want to be reading about the subject matter that a lot of people are trying to shelter them from. They want to read about these things like sexuality, race. They want to read about, it talked about domestic issues and battles with like drugs and alcohol. And I think they want to be exposed to this kind of stuff because either maybe they're going through something like this, or maybe they know someone who's going through a scenario that's going to be laid out for them in one of these pieces. So I thought it was really important that both of those articles talked about, I think a lot of us feel like maybe students need to be sheltered. We watched a video for practicum this week talking about that helicopter teaching, this kind of idea that we need to be very delicate and precise about the way that we go about teaching our students. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think really students are wanting to take on more than we give them credit for. I think they want to read about these very real life issues. And it's true that these realistic fiction pieces don't always have, necessarily the happiest ending. They don't always have a lot of closure at the end of them, but they detail a historical event or something that's happened in a new way for these students. And I think that's something that if they were allowed that intellectual freedom, they would really be able to latch onto. So I've really liked reading about this genre and kind of going over some discussion about this genre. And it really kind of reaffirmed the things that I thought about censorship, even going back to the beginning of the semester, the beginning of last semester. I really do think, if we as educators have the opportunity to give students a look into these experiences that they may not have been exposed to before, why wouldn't we? And we do have to respect, ideas of parents, ideas of administration, but I think it really should be our job to defend it as far as we can go because I consider it really kind of a missed opportunity or like a closing of doors if we have a student that wants to learn about something and we decline them that offer. So I think there's a lot of room for students to learn a lot of life skills through this genre, a lot of emotional relevancy in this genre. There's one of the chapters talked about empathy, teaching the students empathy. So I really think there's a lot that they can take away from this genre. And this reading really has reaffirmed how I felt about censorship and all of that. So I think it's a really important genre to be acquainted with. So yeah, thank you for listening.